Well, I hope that you enjoyed your lunch. Carol and I obviously stayed up all night making sandwiches for you.
What a guy. Great job.
Anyway, after the next break, the snack bar will be closing up, but there are plenty of extra sandwiches back there if you would like a sandwich or two to take for your ride home. There are plastic bags back there, and please help yourself. And I don't know about this next presentation. Well, I do know about it, but I'm not sure I agree with the reluctant swamp fox. I think maybe if it said the aggressive swamp fox, it'd be more to the point. But you decide what Rick's going to tell us. I think it's a very interesting story, and we appreciate the effort that he put into preparing it.
Good afternoon, folks. This is my 4th year here at the Francis Marion Symposium, and I made a presentation last year, and now up here in front of you again. First of all, I want to say thank you to George and Carol for putting this together for us every year, and a round of applause for them. Well, initially when I talked to George and Carol about what the topic I was going to talk about, and I gave them the title or whatever, and then the schedule came out, and I saw that I was going at 1:30 right after lunch. And so I asked them if I could change the title of it, and they told me no, it was too late to do that, but I was going to call it Nap Time with Rick. You know, so this topic came out of what I talked about last year. Last year I was working on my master's thesis about the Bridges campaign, and of course the Bridges campaign was set up by the Rounds campaign. The conditions were kind of set that led Lord Walden to go directly after Marion. So as I was studying the Rounds campaign, and of course looking at what took place between Marion and Sumter, or what didn't take place, I got more into depth about what the actuality was of these occasions. And so I developed this. Reluctant swamp fox. Was Marion really reluctant? Did he really avoid his obligations during the time of the Rounds campaign, or did he not? I'm going to talk to you about some stuff, and then I'll let you decide for yourself whether or not Marion was reluctant. We'll talk about these things. First, we're going to talk about the campaign. There's some of you here that may not know about the Rounds campaign and what it was about. We'll cover that. And then we're going to look at what people said about it. What did the historians and the participants say? And then we're going to talk about the Rounds campaign by looking at the letters and kind of looking at the timing and spacing of what took place during that time. And then, last but not least, we're going to do an analysis of perception versus reality and see where we are. The Rounds campaign. Starting off January, February 1781, all this got started by the Battle of Cowpens. With the victory at Cowpens, the operational and tactical aspects of what took place in the Southern Theater was about to get stood on their head. After the win here at Cowpens, Morgan immediately retreats with his prisoners going up into North Carolina. Lord Cornwallis realizes that he has just lost all of his light troops. Those light troops were critical fighting the partisan folks down here in South Carolina. He needed them back. So Cornwallis starts off in pursuit. Greene realizes this as soon as he gets word of the victory at Cowpens. Greene goes with about 3 staff officers and links up with Morgan. At the same time, he gives marching orders to General Isaac Huger, and Huger is going to come up and link up with Morgan. Also, General Light Horse Harry Lee, Colonel Lee, who was down here operating with Francis Marion, he orders him to report back to the Army. Lee comes up, joins up with Huger, and they go up into North Carolina, and they begin the Fabian tactic of retreating up towards the border of Virginia, drawing Cornwallis farther away from South Carolina. In the meantime, that leaves Marion here in his area of operations. Notice I have not said anything about Thomas Sumter. Thomas Sumter during this time is still recovering from the wounds that he suffered on the 20th of November, 1780 at Blackstock Plantation. Sumter, in his recovery mode, most of his troops are dispersed. He does not have a fighting force at that time that's ready and capable of going out into an action. So, when we look at this operation, this now leaves Marion exposed. So in the process of doing this, Marion has been up operating in this area, and now he is the only show in town without Sumter being out there being able to draw other forces away. Rawdon and Watson come up, and now Rawdon, of course, he is in tactical command in South Carolina. He starts to do operations against Marion. Well, one of the things that they do is, matter of fact, well, I just shoot over to the next slide here. There we go. That's what I was looking for. During this time, Marion sends a letter to General Huger, and he describes the situation as he sees it here in South Carolina. A couple of things that are noteworthy here. First of all, he points out that Colonel Watson is now near Rafting Creek. Rafting Creek is right around in this area, about 15 miles south of Camden. And Watson has set up an operation where he is going to hit Marion's rear when Marion moves against Camden, because they think Marion's going to move up into that area. Deserters came in, told Marion the story. Marion is trying to turn the tables on him. He would like to attack Watson instead. There's a problem. He does not have enough troops. When I was doing my research on the British campaign, one of the things that came out was the paucity of troops that Marion had at the time. And this is going to be a bone of contention later on, that Marion did not have enough troops, and he used that as an excuse. In his letter, dated here, and this was somewhere around the 6th of February, 1781, Marion says that his men are so alarmed at General Greene moving upwards that there's nothing he can do with him. He doesn't even have 200 men, according to his statement. That will carry over into the rest of this campaign. Think about this. May 1780, you lose the entire Continental Army in Charleston, the one in the south, that is. August, you've had the defeat of Gates at Camden. The Army has to withdraw completely out of South Carolina. Now, here you go again, less than a year later, and you've got the 3rd Continental Army has now left the state, moving up into North Carolina, and if they are defeated, what is going to happen to the militia in South Carolina? These guys are concerned. There are several other factors. It's cold weather now in February going into March in 1781. Hey, it's much more comfortable to be with Mama around the fire there in the house than it is to go out on campaign. And then you also have to look at the fact that it's coming up time to plant crops. So there are a number of things that are causing the militia to reconsider getting or answering the call to go to Marion. So he's in dire straits. Marion has to withdraw back into his lair around Snow's Island, and when he does, he is going to disperse his troops. Why do you disperse your troops? Hey, it's a typical partisan type tactic. You do not give them a solid force to be able to focus on. There was a guy named Baron von Clausewitz who wrote a book called On War. And he talked about partisan warfare, and he said that partisans are like vapor. They're there one moment and gone the next. And that's exactly what Marion is doing. Rather than giving a few forces together the opportunity for the enemy to attack them, Marion instead decides to disperse his force and give them no target. During this time, the Gamecock resurrects. Now, during this period, Greene has been trying to get Sumter to come back and get in the saddle again. Hey, it's been a tough recovery. Sumter has taken some serious wounds. He's in a lot of pain. But finally, what happens is Greene convinces him to get back in the saddle again. Now, this is if you read about this stuff, there's a lot of cajoling going on. There's a lot of building up on ego. There's a lot of stoking the fires about, hey, if you don't do this, hey, who else is going to do it? Nobody better than you. And finally, Sumter puts the call out for his troops. And when Sumter puts the calls out for his troops, the same factors that affected Marion being able to get numbers affects Sumter. Before this time, Sumter has been considered to be the strongest force and the biggest problem that the British have in South Carolina. Why? Because at any given time, Sumter can get 1,000 men to answer the call. Huzzah! Yeah, and 1,000 men going huzzah is pretty good. But only 280 answer the call at that time. But he guarantees these folks that you don't have to worry about it. Rawdon only has 200 or 300 men, and he's not going to be able to respond that quickly. Sumter is up here. He forms his troops, but what happens? Rawdon gets word. Sumter is back in the saddle again. Now, what Rawdon will assume is that when Sumter's back in the saddle again, he is going to be operating against 96. Of course, 96 is always that outpost out there that everybody wants to take away in the back country. However, instead of doing that, Sumter comes and operates against Fort Granby. Why? Because there's supplies there. And he needs those supplies to be able to conduct a good operation that he has put together. One thing about Sumter, he doesn't do things in small ways. Rather than going and operating against the British and just trying to occupy them, what he is going to do, he is going to put together an effective campaign that if he can come in and take Fort Granby, come over here and take their supply depot at Belleville, you will also get all these people here south of the Santee to get up in arms against the British. And if you take this area in here, threatening 96, threatening Augusta, it is possible that instead of having Camden isolated, that the British will pull all the way back into Charleston. That is a grandiose plan for a guy that has 280 men. But that is the plan. What is Rawdon going to do? Initially, Rawdon was operating against Marion along with Watson. He gives Watson the mission of taking care of Marion along with Doyle and also McElrath. Rawdon sends Doyle and McElrath after Sumter. Well, what is Sumter doing during this time? He is going to conduct a siege of Fort Granby. Two things you need to be able to conduct a good siege. Number one, you got to have a lot of troops. Number two, you need artillery. Sumter has a few troops and no artillery. They try to use Quaker guns, logs painted to look like cannon, doesn't fake anybody out. So arriving somewhere around the 19th, Sumter is engaged in the attack. He is trying to take Fort Granby. He sends a letter dated the 20th of February, and it says, "Hurry of business obliges me to be laconic." Laconic is a good word. He could have said brief, but he said laconic instead. Okay, and he says he wants Marion to move as to attract his attention, meaning Lord Rawdon, and timely assistance in this way, meaning operating against Rawdon, portends much good to the state. One of the things that amazes me is that you would send a letter to Francis Marion after you're already engaged in your operation against Fort Granby, and you send him this letter, realizing that this letter has to go a long way to even get to a guy as elusive as the gamecock, as elusive as the swamp fox, and be able to expect a timely response. But he does. That's the situation. So he sends his letter off on the 20th. However, you have had Doyle come in, and Doyle is going to be threatening Granby. There's Friday's Ferry. They kind of figured if you threaten Sumter, that he's going to go back the same way he came, which was crossing at Friday's Ferry. Friday's Ferry is just below Fort Granby, and so he sends McElroth with his unit to block Friday's Ferry. Technically, you can get Marion, I'm going to do that Marion and Sumter thing all day long again. Anyways, technically what he's trying to do is get Sumter caught between two forces. However, Sumter decides he's not going to play that game. Actually, some partisans that run across the advancing forces of Doyle goes in and tells Sumter, and Sumter reacts. And what does he react by doing? Instead of trying to cross Friday's Ferry and go back the way he came, he decides he's going to go down the Congaree River to Belleville. He'll do the second part of his plan. He abandons Fort Granby, moves to Belleville. He gets to Belleville somewhere around the 21st, 22nd of February, and he gets there and he immediately tries to do an assault on that location. Burns some of the outbuildings, but he's not able to make headway. He leaves some forces there to hold at Belleville and goes and spends the night around Manigault's plantation, that's south of Belleville. Once he has done that, he gets word that a convoy is on the road. They set up an ambush the next morning, so on the 23rd, they assault this convoy and they're able to capture the whole thing. Now, there is a little atrocity thing going on here where one of the units decided that when these guys they got there late for the actual battle, so when these guys raised their hand to surrender, they fired into them, killed 7, wounded 7. That'll come up later on in the Bridges campaign as they're exchanging letters about who's doing what with atrocities or whatever. Very successful here at Manigault's plantation. You capture all these supplies. One account says there was enough to outfit 3 regiments. There are also these chests that are banded that look very much like the chest that you would have if you got gold for the British payroll. So, hey, Sumter and his guys have hit pay dirt here. This is good. They put all this stuff on, put all the equipment on flat boats, and they're sending it down to the river to another plantation so they can link up with it later. Very good haul. Unfortunately, the boat pilot that they gave it to was a guy named Robert Livingston, who seems to have been a loyalist, and he took those boats right under the cover at Wright's Bluff, a place called Fort Watson. So, you got supplies, you lost supplies in one fell swoop. In the meantime, Sumter goes back to Belleville. At this time, Belleville is being approached by McElroth. Now, we've heard a little bit about McElroth earlier. Kim Stacy talked about him. McElroth approaches. Sumter puts his men into line around Belleville, or at Belleville. McElroth looks at this and says, oh, we're outnumbered. He may have had word that Marion had joined up with Sumter. McElroth retreats 4 miles and goes into camp. Does not try to attack Sumter at all. That is one of the key reasons that McElroth is sent back to New York by Rawdon. After that event at Belleville, Sumter realizes that he is about to be in a bad situation. He's supposedly reinforcements are coming from 96 in the direction of Belleville. There are some forces coming up from the Monk's Corner area up into here. The bad problem is you have somewhere in here is where Sumter comes down to around Flood's plantation, and he is on the wrong side of the river. He is on the south side of the river. He needs to go to the north side. One of the things is finding boats then. He had just lost whatever boats he had that went right to the bluff. These guys have it. The river is high. How are you going to get across? They actually find 2 canoes hidden in the swamp. And over the course of 2 days, it takes them taking 3 men at a time in the 2 canoes with one guy paddling, and he is able to get his horses across with the horses swimming along the side. So they get across the river, and that is somewhere around the 28th of February. 28th of February, Sumter decides he's going to do another thing. He is going to get those supplies back. And what he does is he attacks Fort Watson. And when he attacks Fort Watson, has a little problem there. He did not do an adequate reconnaissance. Instead of having 40 or so men there that had been manning that outpost before, you now have Watson has brought most of his men into that general area. So when Sumter attacks, they suffer a severe repulse. Okay, loses 18 killed, 38 captured. A severe bloody nose. He then decides that he is going to back up, and he comes over to this general area here around Forest Plantation, which is not too far away from Great Savannah, which is Sumter's plantation there on the Santee. Notice, I have not talked to you at all about Francis Marion. Where was Francis Marion with all this? The first thing is, he didn't know. And we're going to talk about that when I get through with this slide. Why? Because Sumter finally gets word from Marion that says, hey, I got your message. This is where I'm going to be. Sumter sends him a letter back that says, hey, glad you're there. Understand your numbers are few. You need to come to me. Marion goes and heads south. However, because the British are occupying in this area, and we understand that Sumter gets word that the British are going to be coming after him, he decides he can't wait, and Sumter heads north. Well, one unit is heading south, the other is heading north. We'll talk about what happened in that situation. But what we will talk about is that Sumter comes up into this area. His wife, who was an invalid, she is Mary Jamison Canny Sumter. She has a withered left arm. She has been an invalid. He goes and polices her up along with his 12-year-old son Tom. And by the 4th of March, he's somewhere in this area, at which point he realizes Marion is not coming, he's not going to be able to see him, so he goes to depart. As he tries to leave, he runs into to Major Frazier and his unit. There's a big battle here at Radcliffe's Bridge. Sumter is able to get across the river, burn the bridge, and then retreats back up into the Waxhaws area up around the new acquisition. And his troops are irritated. His troops feel that they have lied, that he lied to them about raw strength. Some of his troops think that he was in cahoots with the river pilot, and maybe Sumter has gotten some of those the chest of gold out there and deprived them of it. And they are so incensed that Sumter has to have a meeting with them and talk to them and explain his situation. And at the conclusion of that, he disperses his brigade and sends them away. Now, we're going to talk in detail about the letters that were exchanged. But first of all, let's see what people have said throughout history about what I just talked to you about. The things that people say, historians, David Ramsey talks about the Rounds campaign, never mentions Marion at all. He's doing that about 1785. Peter O'Ree, Mason Lockeroons, hey, didn't talk about it at all. Well, why would that be? Well, there was O'Ree's memoirs, not sure how much O'Ree was involved with that. William Dobbin James, he mentions that Sumter and Marion were far apart, a couple of 100 miles, he says. He doesn't talk about the Rounds campaign at all. So why do we get all wrapped up into this Sumter-Marion thing? Good question. William Gilmore Simms, writing about 1844, he doesn't mention the Rounds campaign. Now, in all fairness, folks, I will tell you, if you read any of these folks here, generally, you're going to read the same words almost verbatim in some of these things. Plagiarism was a thing back then, but it wasn't a negative thing, apparently. Gibbs, 1850s. He's put together all the documentary history. And when you look at the Rounds campaign, if you look at Gibbs, there are only 2 letters that I was able to find in there. One of them was, of course, the one that was written there from Fort Granby, the timely assistance really helps. And then the 4th of March, when he writes, "I am so sorry to be far out of the way of meeting with you," which is kind of one of the last letters that Sumter wrote. There's nothing from Marion in there. And from this, you would probably take that, hey, Marion pretty well, gave him the big hand there and didn't respond to him. So subsequently, I think that some of the following historians kind of picked up on that. Edward McCready talks about Sumter, and Sumter had asked Marion to come to his assistance, that they needed to have a conference. His statement, but Marion did not come. He's writing that in 1902. I know when I was doing my research for the Bridges campaign, before I got in depth into some of the letters and stuff, and if I read the general history, unless you were really interested in the Rounds campaign and getting into nuts and bolts and things, you probably are not going to go much beyond what you see in the secondary source. And if you read the secondary sources, it kind of leads you to believe, Marion's a dirtball. You had Sumter ask for support, and Marion, for various reasons, told him no. McCready goes on to say that Marion does not appear to have made any response to the earnest appeal for conference. That pretty well speaks volumes, doesn't it? Would that affect the way that you feel about our famous swamp fox? Robert D. Bass goes on to say, Marion not enthusiastic. He calls him the laggard swamp fox. Hugh Rankin in the 1970s, Marion sulked. Perhaps because of his pique at being forced to serve under Sumter's command. Would Marion have been upset having to serve under Sumter's command? Yeah, I think so. Marion dismissed the greater part of his brigade, telling Sumter that he would not march because the enemy is too strong for me to move. Great way of not having to respond to somebody is tell them you don't have any troops to respond with. John Aller, the most recent and an absolutely fantastic work on Francis Marion, he kind of jumps in on there too. Hey, Marion was not enthusiastic, but then again, Marion did notice his guys didn't stray too far away from home, particularly during that time, and that maybe Marion did not respond with the same sense of urgency that he had used before. In an article by Andrew Waters, Marion did not answer Sumter's call for reinforcement. And he responded with excuses about his paucity of troops and about the strength of the enemy. So as I read all this, I'm thinking, is this really the bottom line on this? Because everything about Marion's character, particularly his military acumen, would tell me that this is absolutely wrong when you look at this. So let's do some further research. But not before looking at what Sumter thought about the whole deal. He sent to Sumter writing to General Greene, no assistance from General Marion. More to